U.S. Marines just seized an Iranian ship the Pentagon believes was moving weapons-linked cargo for Tehran's military, and Iran never saw it coming. For 9 quiet days, that same vessel sat tied up at one of Southeast Asia's busiest gray market ports, just off the Malaysian coast. Nobody paid attention. Nobody ever does with a cargo ship that isn't supposed to matter. But when it went dead in the water inside the Strait of Hormuz, its engine room blown open by an American missile, it stopped being just another stalled container ship. It became the moment Tehran got caught flat-footed, proof that Iran has spent this entire standoff bluffing at a table where everyone can already see its cards and never planned for the day America would actually call it. 6 hours of ignored warnings, 1 precision strike, a team of Marines dropping out of the night sky onto a deck that, hours earlier, still belonged to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and a ship U.S. officials suspect was carrying exactly the kind of sanctioned dual-use military cargo Iran has spent years trying to move without anyone noticing. Tehran wasn't ready for the blockade. It definitely wasn't ready to lose this ship, and even now its government keeps insisting it's the one holding all the leverage. If you want to catch the exact moment this standoff finally tips one way or the other, hit subscribe. This channel follows the Gulf blockade closer than almost anyone else covering it. Now, to understand why one cargo ship could shake an entire regime, you have to rewind further than this year, further even than this war. Iran's habit of running sanctioned cargo didn't start in 2026. Its roots go back to 2018, when the nuclear deal collapsed and Washington slammed Iranian oil exports with sweeping new restrictions. Facing a choice between letting its economy suffocate or getting creative, Tehran picked the second option. Over the years that followed, Iran quietly built what analysts now bluntly call a shadow fleet. Aging tankers and cargo ships with tangled, hard-to-trace ownership, flags swapped out every few months, and transponders that go silent the instant a ship enters contested waters. Iran didn't invent this trick. Venezuela runs a version of it. Russia scaled up its own fleet after the West hit it with sanctions over Ukraine. But Iran had a head start, and by the early 2020s, its shadow fleet was moving enough discounted crude to keep the regime's finances limping along despite years of maximum pressure sanctions. These ships rarely sail straight from an Iranian port to a buyer. Instead, they drift, swap cargo ship to ship out in open water, pass through transshipment hubs across Southeast Asia and the Gulf, then resurface under new names and new flags. Port Klang in Malaysia, where the vessel now known as the Touska reportedly idled for 9 days before making its run at Hormuz, has served as exactly that kind of waypoint for years, a place where cargo with a murky origin can sit just long enough for its paper trail to go cold. None of that by itself is unusual. What made this particular voyage different is what came next. The current stretch of open war traces back to mid-April 2026, when peace talks brokered in Islamabad fell apart completely. Both sides still argue over exactly why, but the fallout was immediate. Washington shifted from enforcing sanctions at a distance to physically sealing off every Iranian port. That's a fundamentally different kind of pressure. Sanctions enforcement used to mean tailing suspicious ships, occasionally stopping one, squeezing a regime financially from afar. A blockade means shutting the door outright. More than half a dozen American destroyers working alongside the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group fanned out across the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Hormuz under one standing order. Nothing enters or leaves Iranian waters without American sign-off. It's worth pausing on how enormous that is. The Strait of Hormuz is, by most measures, the single most critical bottleneck in the entire global energy trade. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a major share of its liquefied natural gas passes through a channel that, at its narrowest, is barely 20 miles wide. For decades, Iran treated its grip on that choke point as leverage, occasionally threatening to seal it off whenever tensions with the West flared. This year, for the first time in a long time, that leverage flipped. It wasn't Iran threatening to shut Hormuz down. It was the United States deciding who gets to use it at all. This isn't Iran's first run-in with a seized tanker either. And that history explains why officials in Tehran understood the stakes the moment the Touska went dark. Back in 2019, British forces seized an Iranian tanker off Gibraltar, accused of running oil to Syria in violation of sanctions. Within weeks, Iran's Revolutionary Guard grabbed a British-flagged tanker in the Strait of Hormuz in what almost everyone read as direct payback. That episode became the blueprint for nearly everything after it. Seize a ship, watch Iran grab a different, unrelated one in response, let the standoff play out quietly through back-channel diplomacy. What sets the Touska apart is scale and visibility. Earlier incidents involved a single ship boarded quietly, barely making the news. This time, the U.S. brought a full blockade posture, a filmed helicopter assault, and a sitting president narrating the whole operation on social media within hours. Iran has seen this movie before. It just hasn't seen this budget. America's top military officer laid out the new rules of engagement before anyone touched a single ship. Vessels attempting to break the blockade would get warning shots first, and any ship that kept going after that would be boarded by force. That's exactly what happened to the Touska. Nearly 1,000 feet long, close to the scale of an American aircraft carrier, the ship spent 6 hours trying to outrun the blockade before the destroyer, tracking it, disabled its engine room with a single strike. Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit fast roped onto the deck from helicopters launched off the USS Tripoli. Nothing about Tehran's response in the hours after suggests a government that had rehearsed for this. This wasn't Iran's first loss of this kind, but by a wide margin, it was its most public one. Iran had watched individual tankers get quietly intercepted before, the kind of story that shows up in a maritime trade. Newsletter and nowhere else. This time, Central Command released footage. This time, the American president posted about it personally within hours, describing in blunt, almost offhand terms exactly how the crew was warned, refused to comply, and got disabled for it. The real audience wasn't Tehran alone. It was every captain still weighing whether to test the blockade, and every government still watching to see if Washington's threats actually carried weight. There's a useful comparison here, and it isn't flattering for Iran. Years earlier, Washington ran a similar playbook against Venezuela, another sanctioned oil exporter accused of operating its own shadow fleet. American forces seized Venezuelan-linked tankers off that country's coast. And Caracas cried piracy in almost the same language Iranian officials would later use about the Touska. That parallel matters because it reframes the story. This isn't a uniquely Iranian humiliation. It's the latest chapter of a playbook Washington has now run more than once. And Iran has just joined that club, whether it wants the comparison or not. Which brings us to the ship itself and the harder question underneath it. Why this vessel, why this cargo, and why Tehran seems so reluctant to say plainly what was actually on board? Here's where this story deserves more than a headline. The mechanics behind how a modern blockade actually finds, disables, and boards one specific ship are more interesting than the raw footage lets on. Start with the problem American commanders were facing. The Strait of Hormuz and the wider Arabian Sea carry enormous volumes of completely legitimate traffic every single day. Tankers and container ships from dozens of countries hauling oil, grain, electronics, everything. You can't just stop every ship. That would choke off global trade far beyond anything aimed at Iran, and it would turn friendly shipping nations into instant adversaries. So enforcement works more like a filter than a wall. Every vessel heading toward the strait gets tracked through a mix of satellite surveillance, radar from the destroyers on station, and AIS data. The transponder signal most commercial ships are legally required to broadcast. It functions less like a locked gate and more like airport security, only pulling aside passengers who trip specific flags. An Iranian flag is one. Ownership records tracing back to sanctioned entities is another. And a ship that's gone dark, its transponder mysteriously cutting out, a classic Shadow Fleet move, is the biggest flag of all, since legitimate shipping has no reason to vanish from tracking mid-voyage. The Touska apparently tripped several of these at once. Its recent stop in Port Klang, a known laundering point for exactly this kind of cargo, had investigators watching before it ever entered the strait. The ship also sailed under the flag of Iran's State Shipping Line, a company Washington sanctioned back in 2019 for serving, in the government's own words, as the preferred carrier for Iranian arms procurement, including material tied to Iran's ballistic missile program. Analysts digging into the Touska's ownership reportedly found layers of shell companies tracing back into China, and maritime security sources briefed on the interception said the ship was likely carrying what Washington classifies as dual-use military equipment, the kind of tangled structure and cargo legitimate shippers rarely bother with, because they have nothing to hide. No cargo manifest was made public in the first day after the boarding. The president himself said only that American forces had full custody of the ship and were seeing what's on board, which, on its own, tells you Tehran had no plan in place for what happens after one of its weapons-linked vessels actually gets boarded. It helps to understand what going dark actually involves, since the phrase gets thrown around loosely. AIS transponders continuously broadcast a ship's location, speed, and identity, and switching one off mid-voyage is technically as simple as flipping a switch on the bridge. Shadow Fleet operators have turned that into something close to an art, killing the transponder during the least watched stretch of a route, repainting names and registries at sea, and sometimes running what's called identity spoofing, briefly broadcasting a completely different, legitimate ship's credentials to throw off satellite trackers. None of it is foolproof. In fact, that's exactly the pattern that, once spotted enough times on the same hull, builds the case file that eventually gets a ship intercepted. Once a vessel is flagged, the next question is what to do about it, and that's where the blockade's rules of engagement come in. The protocol starts with a warning phase. Hail the ship by radio, order it to stop for inspection, give the crew a window to comply. With the Touska, that window stretched to 6 hours, unusually long by military standards, suggesting commanders either genuinely wanted to avoid a fight or were under orders to make the eventual use of force look unmistakably justified. Either way, the ship kept moving. When a vessel won't stop, commanders are left choosing between escalating or letting it slip through. And letting it through defeats the entire point of a blockade. So the destroyer assigned to the Touska fired specifically at the engine room. Not the hull, not the bridge. That's a deliberate choice, and it tells you what the operation was actually trying to accomplish. Sinking the ship would have destroyed the cargo and any evidence with it, and would have handed Iran a real humanitarian and propaganda disaster if crew members had died. Disabling the engine room instead achieved the military goal, stopping the ship while keeping it intact enough to board, search, and use as both intelligence and public justification for the blockade itself. That's where Phase 2 kicks in, the part that actually made global headlines, the boarding. In naval terms, this is a VESS operation, visit, board, search, and seizure, a tactic with a long history in counter-piracy and sanctions work, though rarely carried out at this scale, and almost never this publicly. Marines rappelling from helicopters onto a hostile deck sounds like a battlefield assault, and visually it plays like one, but functionally it's closer to an extremely heavily armed customs inspection. The ship was already dead in the water. The crew had no real way to resist a fully armed Marine expeditionary unit. The actual danger in these operations comes less from the chance of a firefight, and more from boarding an unfamiliar ship in the dark, not knowing what structural damage, hazards, or panicked crew might be waiting below. So why go with this instead of simply shadowing the ship and quietly intercepting it diplomatically once it reached a friendly port? Because deterrence only works if it's visible. A quiet diplomatic seizure sends no signal to the next captain thinking about testing the blockade. A filmed operation, topped off with a presidential post describing it in plain language, sends one nobody can miss. This wasn't really a legal maneuver. It was a demonstration built to be watched. Washington's legal justification ties the blockade to enforcement of existing sanctions on Iranian military and weapons-linked trade, giving American forces authority to search and seize ships reasonably suspected of carrying prohibited cargo. Whether that framing would survive sustained international scrutiny is a separate question from whether it's currently being enforced. And right now, enforcement is the only variable that matters to any ship actually trying to cross that stretch of water. There's another detail worth not skipping past. Investigators weren't just going on instinct and flags. According to reporting, U.S. Central Command has spent months quietly building a systematic profile of the Shadow Fleet, cross-referencing satellite tracking with known transshipment patterns, essentially assembling an intelligence picture that makes catching a ship like the Touska look less like luck and more like the payoff of a patient surveillance campaign that had been running long before this particular vessel ever showed up on anyone's radar. There's a reason this story only gets more complicated the closer you look. And that's what the next part explains. Behind every seized ship and every furious statement out of Tehran, there's a second war running underneath the headlines, fought with balance sheets, frozen bank accounts, and carefully scripted state broadcasts. In some ways, it's this war that will actually decide how everything ends. Start with the raw numbers, because they're brutal and easy to state. The U.S. estimates the blockade alone is draining roughly $500 million a day out of an Iranian economy that was already buckling under years of prior sanctions. Central Command says it has intercepted around 85 vessels attempting to move through Iranian waters since the blockade began, with 3 ships fully seized, the Touska among them. Independent maritime tracking data suggests only a small slice of attempted crossings, somewhere around 24, have made it through untouched. Stack that against Iran's near-total dependence on oil exports and shipping revenue, and you get a regime bleeding out in a way that doesn't announce itself in one dramatic headline, but compounds every single day the blockade holds. Then there's the frozen assets question, arguably the most aggressive financial move of the entire conflict, and one that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. Washington has held a large pool of Iranian assets frozen for years, reportedly somewhere between $124 and $167 billion, depending on whose estimate you trust. The American decision to simply deduct damages from Houthi attacks on commercial shipping directly out of those frozen funds amounts to a genuinely precedent-setting escalation. Iran's foreign minister publicly warned that normalizing this kind of confiscation, using a country's own frozen money to cover damage caused by its proxies, sets a dangerous precedent that could rattle sovereign asset holders well beyond Iran. That's a notable admission because it's essentially an Iranian official conceding that the U.S. holds financial leverage Tehran has no real answer for. Now add the propaganda layer, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting analytically. Iranian state media has consistently framed this entire war as something forced on Iran by outside powers, Israel especially, rather than the product of Tehran's own strategic decisions. That's not laziness or accident. It's a deliberate domestic messaging strategy, designed less to convince the outside world and more to hold together internal political support at a moment when the regime's actual military capacity has visibly crumbled. When Iranian officials insist, as they did just this week, that Iran, not Washington, will decide when this war ends, that line isn't really aimed at the Pentagon. It's aimed at Iranian citizens and regional allies, and attempt to project control at exactly the moment both are in shortest supply. The internal politics matter here too. Iran's response since losing the Touska has notably avoided any direct strike on American warships, which would risk an overwhelming escalation Tehran can't currently absorb. Instead, the Navy of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has fallen back on a tactic it's used for over a decade, seizing unrelated commercial ships near its own coast as bargaining chips, a pattern intelligence analysts have tracked through multiple earlier Gulf standoffs. Within days of losing the Touska, the Guard captured 2 foreign-flagged tankers near its coastline, accusing them of unspecified maritime violations. Iranian officials have even floated charging transit fees on any vessel passing through Hormuz, an attempt to reassert control through economic pressure, now that military pressure isn't an option. Diplomatically, the picture is just as fractured. Back in June, both sides reportedly reached a memorandum of understanding that would have unfrozen some Iranian assets in exchange for de-escalation. As of now, neither side is honoring it. An earlier ceasefire has come and gone, broken repeatedly by strikes from both directions. Omani diplomats have shuttled between Washington and Tehran trying to build some kind of durable framework for shipping traffic through the strait, producing plenty of statements and photo ops, but nothing that's actually held. Senior UN officials have pushed both sides back toward the table, with one mediator saying flatly that there's no realistic path to ending this war outside of diplomacy. Iran's public position is oddly contradictory on exactly this point. Officials claim to support renewed talks in one breath, then insist in the next that Iran has no intention of sitting back down with Washington anytime soon. That's not really a messaging failure. It's a fairly honest snapshot of where Iran's leadership actually stands. Exhausted and weakened enough to genuinely want the fighting to stop, but too politically boxed in domestically to be the side seen asking for it first. Admitting weakness openly inside a system built largely on projecting revolutionary resilience carries its own steep internal cost, arguably steep enough that continuing to absorb. Damage looks, from inside the regime, like the safer option. There's also a quieter power struggle running underneath all of this between Iran's conventional military and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, an ideological parallel force that controls much of the country's missile program, its regional proxy network, and increasingly its economic assets too. The Guard has effectively driven the retaliatory strategy through this entire war, favoring proxy pressure and hostage-style seizures at sea over the direct confrontation Iran's regular Navy and Air Force simply aren't positioned to sustain. Every time state media spotlights an IRGC tanker seizure instead of a naval engagement, it's a small signal about who's actually setting policy right now. And that matters, because the Guard has historically shown a far higher appetite for risk and escalation than Iran's conventional forces or its diplomats. None of that changes what this war is actually costing real people on both sides, and that part deserves slowing down for. Behind the ship seizures, the frozen billions, and the state media, statements are people whose entire lives have been reduced to a single line in a Pentagon briefing or a state news release. Start with the Touska's own crew. In an unusually candid admission for a government that rarely explains its hesitation, Iranian officials said their retaliation was being deliberately delayed because family members of the crew were reportedly aboard the ship during the seizure. Whatever the cargo turns out to be, whatever the ownership records were hiding, the people actually standing on that deck when Marines dropped down were, by every available account, working sailors, and possibly their relatives, caught in the middle of a geopolitical fight they had no part in starting. The human cost on the American and Allied side has been just as real, even if it's gotten far less daily coverage. The Pentagon has confirmed American service members killed in Iranian retaliatory strikes, including a young staff sergeant from Queens, New York, whose death at a U.S. base in Jordan wasn't officially confirmed until weeks after it happened. A delay that's drawn fair criticism over how slowly military casualties have been disclosed throughout this war. Close to 100 additional troops have reportedly been injured, officially described as mostly minor, though the true scope of that toll appears to have been slow reaching the public record. Behind each of those numbers is a family that learned their loved one was hurt or killed weeks after. The fact through official channels moving far slower than the news cycle around a seized cargo ship. Iranian civilians have absorbed real damage too. Strikes near Bushehr, home to one of Iran's key nuclear facilities, reportedly triggered air defense activations as explosions shook the surrounding area. In at least one province, a hospital was forced to evacuate more than 200 patients after a nearby strike damaged surrounding homes and blew out windows across the district. The kind of incident that barely registers in Western coverage of a naval blockade, but represents a genuine disruptive crisis for the people actually living through it. Iranian state media has offered limited detail on the scale of damage in several coastal areas, which makes independent verification difficult, but the pattern of intensifying strikes alongside the naval campaign shows up consistently across multiple reports. Then there's the slower, quieter cost that never makes a dramatic headline, the economic pain rippling outward from a shipping lane that carries a huge share of the world's oil. American drivers are reportedly paying close to 40% more at the pump than before this war started, a direct downstream effect of instability in the Strait, combined with renewed Houthi attacks disrupting Red Sea shipping at the same time. That's not a headline built for outrage. It's a slow-motion tax on ordinary households thousands of miles from the Gulf, paid quietly every time someone fills up a tank. It would be easy, and honestly a little lazy, to flatten all of this into a clean story about American strength versus Iranian weakness, or just as easily, into a story about American aggression against a cornered state. Neither version survives contact with the actual details. Washington's argument that a nation systematically dodging sanctions to fund weapons programs and proxy militias forfeits some claim to unimpeded shipping isn't unreasonable on its face. Iran's argument that a foreign navy disabling and boarding its commercial ships in international waters amounts to an act of war, regardless of what's in the cargo hold, isn't unreasonable either, at least as a matter of principle, even coming from a regime with a long record of exactly the sanctions evasion it's now being punished for. There's no version of this conflict where the ordinary sailor, the young sergeant from Queens, or the family relocated from a damaged hospital ward gets any say in how it plays out. They just live with decisions made in Washington and Tehran alike. That tension between the cold logic of strategic deterrence and the very real people caught inside it is exactly what makes predicting where this heads next so genuinely hard. So where does this actually go from here? Based on everything currently on the table, 4 paths look plausible, and they carry very different levels of risk. The first, and the one officials on both sides would publicly claim to prefer, is a real diplomatic off-ramp built around the current pause in American strikes. As of the latest reporting, the U.S. has gone roughly 2 straight nights without launching new strikes on Iranian territory, which officials close to the talks describe as a deliberate choice to give diplomacy room to breathe rather than any formal ceasefire. If Amani-brokered talks manage to produce something sturdier than another abandoned memorandum, this could become the first real de-escalation point since the war began back in February. The problem is that both sides have already walked away from one negotiated framework this year, the June memorandum that was supposed to unfreeze assets in exchange for de-escalation, and instead collapsed almost immediately. A pause isn't the same thing as trust, and nothing in the current record suggests either side has built up much of it. The second path, and arguably the more likely one given the pattern so far, is continued proxy escalation rather than direct confrontation. Iran has spent this entire war avoiding direct hits on American warships in favor of leaning on regional proxies, most visibly Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping, alongside its own habit of grabbing unrelated commercial vessels near its coast as bargaining chips. Expect more of exactly that. It's a strategy that lets Tehran project strength at home without inviting the kind of overwhelming retaliation a direct strike on U.S. forces would guarantee. The catch is that proxy escalation has already pushed oil prices past $100 a barrel once this year, and every additional Houthi attack risks pulling Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states more directly into a conflict Iran can increasingly afford to widen even less. The third path is a more direct Iranian attempt to reassert control over Hormuz itself, through measures like the transit, fees, and IRGC coordination requirements Tehran has floated, effectively trying to claim de facto authority over international waters through economic coercion, since military coercion is off the table. This is a genuinely risky move for Iran to try, and I'd put real weight on it happening in some form, precisely because it costs Tehran almost nothing militarily, while forcing Washington to either escalate to stop it or watch the blockade's credibility erode. The problem? Any real attempt to close or toll the strait almost certainly triggers an immediate American response, given how explicitly Washington has framed free passage through Hormuz as a red line, and Iran's Navy, by the Pentagon's own assessment, isn't in any condition to back up that kind of confrontation with force. The fourth and most volatile path opened almost out of nowhere in the last few days, a genuine second front against Ukraine, following a Ukrainian strike on an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea that killed one person and injured 3 others. Iranian officials have already branded the strike an act of illegal aggression that can't go unanswered. The uncomfortable thread connecting these 2 wars is Iran's deepening military relationship with Moscow, a partnership that has made Iranian assets fair targets inside Ukraine's fight for survival against Russia. If Iran responds to the Caspian incident with retaliation against Ukrainian interests, it opens a second active front at exactly the moment its military has the least capacity in years to handle even one. That combination, minimal capacity, maximum overextension, is precisely the kind of setup that produces miscalculation. And miscalculation is historically how regional wars turn into something much bigger. If I had to rank these by what's most likely to actually happen over the next few weeks, proxy escalation stays the default, simply because it's the path Iran has repeatedly shown it's willing to walk. The diplomatic off-ramp is possible but fragile, and I wouldn't bet on it holding without a much stronger enforcement mechanism than either side has produced so far. The Hormuz coercion attempt and the Ukraine front are both lower probability, higher consequence scenarios, the kind of moves that could redefine the scale of this conflict within days, not months, if either one actually materializes. Which brings us back to where this story started. Tehran keeps sitting down at this table, pushing chips forward like it's still holding a strong hand. But strip away the statements and the state media framing, and what's actually left in front of the regime is a navy the Pentagon says has been effectively neutralized, an air force running on a fraction of its drone arsenal, an economy bleeding $500 million a day, and a diplomatic track record of walking away from its own signed agreements. A bluff only works as long as nobody calls. It, and the United States, over the past several months, has been calling it methodically, one seized ship and one frozen dollar at a time. The seizure of the Touska back in April was never really about one weapons-linked cargo ship. It was the moment the bluff started to become visible from the outside, the moment it became clear that Tehran wasn't ready, hadn't planned for it, and had no real answer. Once the ship it was counting on to slip through actually got caught, it exposed how far Iran's threats had drifted from its actual ability to back them up. Months later, with a new front potentially opening against Ukraine and Iran's military stretched thinner than at any point in recent memory, the gap keeps widening. Whether it eventually forces Iran to the table on Washington's terms, or whether a cornered regime with nothing left to lose decides escalation is its best remaining move, is genuinely the open question heading into the next few weeks. Watch what happens the next time a ship tries to run this blockade. How Tehran responds in that moment will tell you more about the real state of this war than anything coming out of its foreign ministry. So here's the question actually worth sitting with. Does a government keep bluffing once everyone at the table can already see its hand? Or is refusing to fold, even with nothing left to bet, sometimes the only move a cornered regime believes it has left? Drop your read in the comments. And if you want to catch the next chapter of this the moment it breaks, subscribe.